On the afternoon of September 6, 1976, at approximately 1:48 p.m. local time, the control tower at Hakodate Municipal Airport on the southern coast of Japan's northernmost main island, Hokkaido, received a radio transmission from an unidentified aircraft. The call was entirely unexpected. No aircraft matching the contact's approach trajectory had filed a flight plan with the airport, and no arrivals were scheduled from the direction it appeared to be approaching. The voice on the frequency was male, speaking in fragmented English, a combination of phonetically rehearsed phrases and what the controller on duty would later describe in an official report as barely concealed urgency. The pilot was requesting emergency landing clearance. He gave no registration number, no aircraft type. He said only that he was almost out of fuel. Before the controller could respond with instructions, the aircraft appeared over the airport's perimeter. It was not a commercial airliner. It was not a private plane. It was not anything that anyone in the Hakodate Tower had ever seen approach their runway, moving at a speed far exceeding the normal approach velocity for any aircraft that used the airport. A gray jet swept in low over the surrounding residential streets and touched down heavily on the tarmac, at what witnesses on the ground would later estimate was somewhere near double the appropriate landing speed. The aircraft's brakes screamed against the pavement. The jet slid past the midpoint of the runway, then past the three-quarter mark. Airport workers standing near the terminal described the moment as one of frozen incomprehension, the realization, arriving almost too late, that the aircraft was not going to stop before the end of the pavement. The plane stopped with approximately 800 feet of runway remaining. In the tower, the controller was already reaching for the emergency telephone. On the tarmac below, workers had stopped what they were doing and stood staring at the gray aircraft now sitting motionless at the far end of the strip. It was a jet fighter, a Soviet jet fighter. The red stars on its wings and fuselage were clearly visible even at distance. The cockpit canopy opened. A man descended to the tarmac and stood beside the aircraft. He was wearing a Soviet Air Force flight suit. He raised both hands above his head. Then, in English he had spent months practicing in secret, he said the words he had prepared for this moment, that he was requesting political asylum in the United States and that he needed to speak to American authorities. His name was Viktor Ivanovich Belenko. He was 29 years old. He was a senior lieutenant in the Soviet Air Defense Forces assigned to one of the most secretive fighter aviation units in the Soviet military's vast and compartmentalized structure, and the aircraft he had just landed, a MiG-25P Foxbat, tail number 31, was, as of that afternoon, the most classified military aircraft in the Soviet arsenal, now sitting on Japanese soil. The Cold War had just become considerably more complicated for the Soviet Union. If you follow Cold War intelligence history and the documented stories of the people caught inside it, subscribe and turn on notifications. We cover these cases every week, drawing on declassified records, primary sources, and the testimonies of those involved. Now, to understand what Viktor Belenko actually did and why, we need to start where he did. Viktor Belenko was born on February 15th, 1947, in the city of Nalchik, the capital of the Kabardino-Balkar Autonomous Soviet Socialist Republic, a mountainous region in the northern Caucasus that occupied a peripheral position in the Soviet state's geography and consciousness. His early childhood was, by the standards of post-war Soviet life, difficult in ways that were nonetheless ordinary, the kind of hardship that permeated millions of Soviet lives without announcing itself as exceptional. His father Ivan was largely absent, providing little in the way of the stable domestic infrastructure that a young child requires. His mother struggled to maintain the household alone. Viktor was raised in part by his grandparents, spending significant portions of his childhood in circumstances that instilled in him both a capacity for self-reliance and an early visceral awareness of the gap between what the Soviet system promised and what it actually delivered to the people living at its margins. According to the account of his defection compiled by American journalist John Barron in the 1980 book MiG Pilot, The Final Escape of Lalit, Belenko, which drew on extensive debriefings of Belenko by American intelligence officials and on personal interviews conducted over several years, Viktor demonstrated a pronounced aptitude for technical subjects from an early age. He was drawn to aviation the way many young Soviet men of his generation were, through a combination of state-sponsored enthusiasm for flight as a symbol of national achievement and the genuine romance of aircraft that transcended political ideology. The Soviet military aviation system offered something specific and valuable to young men of ambition who lacked the family connections or party patronage required to advance through other channels. A meritocratic pathway, at least in its early stages, where demonstrated technical skill could open doors that birth alone could not. For a young man from Nalchik with no influential relatives and a difficult domestic history, it was, in practical terms, one of the most promising options available. Belenko entered the Soviet military aviation system through the standard route available to candidates of his background and ability. He applied to and was accepted by a military aviation training program, underwent the rigorous multi-year curriculum that the Soviet Air Force imposed on its fighter pilots, and eventually qualified to fly high-performance jet aircraft. He was selected for assignment to the Soviet Air Defense Forces, known by its Russian acronym PVO Strany, a contraction of Vojska Protivovozdushnoi Oborony, or Air Defense Forces, a distinct branch of the Soviet military that operated separately from the Air Force proper. The PVO's mission was unambiguous: defend Soviet airspace against penetration by foreign aircraft, whether strategic bombers carrying nuclear weapons, reconnaissance platforms attempting to photograph Soviet facilities, or tactical fighters operating in support of ground forces. Its pilots flew the most advanced interceptor aircraft the Soviet Union produced and were charged with one of the most critical defensive missions in Soviet military doctrine. It was, in certain respects, an elite service, one whose prestige derived from both the technology it operated and the existential importance of what it was asked to defend. By the early 1970s, Belenko had been assigned to the 513th Fighter Aviation Regiment, stationed at the Chuguyevka Air Base in the Primorsky Krai region of the Soviet Far East, northeast of Vladivostok. The assignment placed him about as far from the centers of Soviet power and culture as the Soviet Union's geography permitted. The base was remote, surrounded by dense coniferous forest and mountain terrain that was harsh in summer and brutal in winter, with temperatures dropping well below zero for months at a stretch. The facilities were functional, but not comfortable by any standard that would have seemed ordinary to a Western military pilot. Housing for junior officers and their families was cramped and often poorly maintained. Buildings that had been serviceable when built were deteriorating without adequate resources for upkeep, a symptom of the bureaucratic dysfunction that afflicted much of Soviet infrastructure outside the showcase institutions that received priority attention and funding. The food in the base canteen was frequently inadequate in quality. He had married a woman named Ludmila. Together they had a son, Dmitry, who was still a young child in 1976, and the family lived on or near the base, as was standard for Soviet military families at remote installations of this type. Belenko's career, outwardly, was progressing along the lines that the system rewarded. He had demonstrated genuine flying ability and had been assigned to fly the regiment's most advanced aircraft, the MiG-25P Foxbat. It was, in the hierarchy of Soviet military aviation, a prestigious assignment, one that acknowledged real skill and that carried with it access to capabilities unavailable to most Soviet military pilots. It was also, as Belenko would eventually make clear to American intelligence officials, an assignment that taught him considerably more than the Soviet military had intended about the distance between a weapon's fearsome reputation and its operational reality. The disillusionment that would eventually drive Belenko to do what he did had not arrived as a single revelation. It had deepened through years of accumulated experience and observation, deepening through the accumulation of small contradictions until the ideological framework that was supposed to organize and explain them could no longer bear the weight. He had grown up, as had virtually every Soviet citizen of his generation, with a comprehensive worldview that explained his circumstances and justified the sacrifices they entailed. The Soviet Union was building toward a genuinely more just and equal society. The party's leadership was wise and its judgments reliable, and the system's visible failures were the temporary residue of historical circumstances rather than evidence of structural rot. The aviation system had seemed, initially, to exemplify what was best about that project: technical excellence, professional pride, a meritocracy of demonstrated ability operating within a framework of shared purpose. What Belenko encountered at Chuguyevka complicated that framework at every level. The corruption that was endemic throughout Soviet society was present at the airbase as it was everywhere else. Party officials and senior officers lived materially better than junior pilots in ways that no official explanation satisfactorily accounted for. The ideology that proclaimed equality as its foundational value was most conspicuously violated by the people charged with implementing it. Equipment that pilots depended on was poorly maintained, not because parts were impossible to obtain, but because the bureaucratic structures for managing maintenance had degraded through the same indifference and self-dealing that characterized Soviet institutions at every level of the hierarchy. Experienced pilots watched capable colleagues advance or stall in their careers based on factors that had more to do with political reliability and personal connections than with flying ability or professional judgment. He had, at some point, he later found difficult to date precisely, begun listening to foreign radio broadcasts, specifically the Russian language programming of Voice of America and similar Western services that broadcast into Soviet territory. For a military officer holding a security clearance and flying classified aircraft, this was both technically illegal and professionally dangerous in ways that could have ended his career, or worse, had it been detected. He had also, according to his later accounts, obtained prohibited publications, Western magazines, newspaper excerpts, other materials that circulated clandestinely among people willing to accept the risks of possessing them, and had studied them with the systematic attention of someone trying to construct an accurate picture of a world he had been told was inferior and declining. The picture that assembled itself over several years was of an American society that, whatever its genuine contradictions and imperfections, offered its citizens a degree of freedom and material stability that stood in marked contrast to what Soviet propaganda characterized as a declining and corrupt West. The distance between American reality, as best Belenko could understand it, from imperfect and prohibited sources, and Soviet reality, which he could observe without intermediary every day at the base in Primorsky Krai, seemed to him to have been systematically misrepresented by a system whose legitimacy required that misrepresentation. By the mid-1970s, Belenko had begun to think seriously about defection. The consideration was not impulsive and was not completed quickly. He turned it over in his mind for months, then over a year, examining the logistics of what such an action would require and weighing the consequences it would produce. He understood that a Soviet military pilot who flew a classified aircraft to a Western-aligned country would be classified as a traitor under Soviet law, with consequences that would extend to his family, to Ludmila, to Dmitri, to his parents. He understood that the action would sever him, almost certainly permanently, from everything familiar: his country, his language, his culture, every person he had known throughout his life. He understood that the life he might build in the West was uncertain, and that the reception he would receive could not be predicted in detail. He also understood something that gave the contemplated action its strategic dimension: that the aircraft he flew every day was, from the perspective of Western military intelligence, of extraordinary value, and that landing it on Western accessible soil would mean, inevitably, that the aircraft would be examined by people who would learn a great deal from it. This was not a consideration that would have discouraged most people from defecting. For Belenko, it appears to have been one of the factors that made the defection viable, a guarantee that his arrival would be taken seriously, his information valued, and his request for asylum honored without equivocation. The MiG-25 had entered the awareness of Western intelligence in July 1967, when examples of the aircraft appeared at the Domodedovo Aviation Day outside Moscow. The aircraft, displayed at that point under its developmental designation, the YE-266, was unmistakably something new, larger than any previous Soviet fighter, twin-tailed with enormous engines and an airframe that appeared to represent a fundamental advance in Soviet aerospace engineering. The performance characteristics demonstrated during the display, as interpreted by Western aviation analysts watching from the observation areas, had no equivalent in anything than flying in Western air forces. The raw numbers that analysts calculated from what they observed, maximum speed, altitude ceiling, rate of climb, suggested a machine that belonged to a different category than anything NATO operated. In the years that followed, Western intelligence services worked to understand what they had seen, constructing assessments from fragmentary and often speculative information, radar returns from tracking stations at the periphery of Soviet airspace, signals intelligence gathered from electronic emissions, visual observation from the limited opportunities that presented themselves, and whatever could be inferred from the photographic record. The methodology was inherently limited. Constructing accurate performance assessments from external observation without access to the aircraft's systems, engines, or internal structure required significant assumptions, and intelligence analysts, operating in an institutional environment that rewarded caution and erred toward worst-case estimates when dealing with potential threats, made those assumptions in directions that served the interests of preparedness rather than of parsimony. What they concluded was alarming. The MiG-25, designated the Foxbat in NATO's aircraft reporting system, appeared capable of sustained speeds approaching Mach 3.2, nearly 3 times the speed of sound, making it, if the assessments were correct, the fastest operational combat aircraft anywhere in the world. American SR-71 Blackbird reconnaissance aircraft operating at extreme altitude near Soviet territory had on occasion been tracked by MiG-25s, scrambled to intercept them, and those exchanges demonstrated that the Soviet aircraft could reach altitudes and speeds that Western fighters found difficult to match. In the Middle East in 1971, Soviet MiG-25s deployed to Egypt conducted photographic reconnaissance missions over Israeli-controlled territory with apparent impunity. Israeli F-4 Phantom fighters were unable to intercept the Soviet aircraft, which flew too high and too fast to be engaged. The MiG-25s returned from those missions unmolested, their cameras documenting Israeli military positions, while the most capable aircraft in the Israeli inventory could do nothing to prevent it. The conclusion that many Western analysts drew, and that would drive American weapons procurement for years, was that the Soviet Union had produced a fighter of extraordinary capability, one that potentially threatened to render obsolete the aircraft and doctrines around which NATO air defense had been built. The United States Air Force's response to the perceived Foxbat threat was substantial and expensive. The F-15 Eagle, whose development contract was awarded in 1969 and which would enter American service in 1976, the same year as Belenko's defection, was designed explicitly in part as a direct counter to the threat the MiG-25 was then understood to pose. The requirement for an aircraft capable of defeating the Foxbat shaped the F-15's design specifications in fundamental ways, influencing everything from its engine power requirements to its aerodynamic configuration. The development program cost billions of dollars. The tactical doctrine, training curricula, and threat assessments that shaped American military planning across multiple service branches were all built partly around a version of the MiG-25 that existed primarily in the intelligence community's best guesses, constructed from limited information and, in critical respects, significant misreadings that would not be corrected until a Soviet pilot landed the actual machine on a civilian runway in northern Japan. Viktor Belenko flew the actual aircraft. He knew what it could do. More importantly, he knew what it could not. He selected September 6th, 1976 as the day. On the morning of September 6th, 1976, Belenko reported for duty at the 513th Fighter Aviation Regiment's flight operations at Chuguyevka in the same manner he had reported for hundreds of previous flights. He was scheduled for a solo training sortie, a routine exercise of the kind he had flown dozens of times before. His pre-flight preparations were observed by colleagues and ground crew who later reported nothing unusual about his demeanor or behavior. There was nothing in the account of those who saw him that morning that suggested anything other than a pilot preparing for an ordinary day's work. He filed his flight plan, completed his pre-flight checks, climbed into the cockpit of MiG-25P No. 31, and received clearance for takeoff. He lifted off at approximately 12:50 p.m. local Soviet Far Eastern time and began climbing to altitude. Then he deviated from his flight plan. What followed was a sequence Belenko had rehearsed in his mind over many months, working through the specific challenges of each phase of the planned route until he could manage them without hesitation. He descended to extremely low altitude. Some accounts, drawing on Barron's reconstruction of the flight, suggest as low as 100 feet above the terrain to avoid Soviet ground-based radar systems, which were calibrated to detect aircraft flying at normal operational altitudes, rather than threading through valleys and following topographic contours at speed. Flying at very low altitude in a high-performance fighter is extraordinarily demanding under any circumstances. The margins for error are measured in fractions of seconds, and the physiological demands on the pilot, managing violent turbulence, maintaining spatial orientation, reading terrain at closing speeds of several hundred miles per hour, are extreme. The MiG-25 was not designed for low-altitude flight, and Belenko was operating well outside its intended performance envelope for the initial phase of the route, relying on skill and careful prior planning to manage an aircraft that was being asked to do something its designers had not intended. Soviet ground radar eventually detected him as he climbed back toward cruising altitude to cross the final stretch of water between the Soviet coast and Hokkaido. The 513th Regiment's command post attempted to reach him by radio. Belenko did not respond. Scrambles were ordered, other MiG-25s launched to intercept or identify the errant aircraft. But by the time those aircraft were airborne and establishing their search patterns, Belenko had already entered Japanese airspace and was descending toward his destination. The Japanese Air Self-Defense Force scrambled F-104 starfighter interceptors from Chitose Air Base on Hokkaido to investigate the unidentified aircraft that had penetrated Japanese airspace without clearance or prior notice. The F-104s located the MiG-25 in a brief and disorganized encounter complicated by the speed differential between the two aircraft types and by the difficulties of radio communication with a pilot transmitting on no standard frequency. They did not succeed in redirecting or escorting the Soviet jet to a designated military facility before Belenko had already committed to his approach toward the coast. He had chosen Hakodate over the nearer military installation at Chitose deliberately, and the reasoning was specific. Landing at a civilian airport would place him under the protection of Japanese civil authorities, police, airport security, civilian officials, rather than military personnel whose responses were more difficult to predict and whose chain of command connected more directly to the military-to-military relationships between Japan and the Soviet Union. At a civilian airport, he would have time to identify himself and make his request for asylum before events could escalate in unpredictable directions. The calculation was correct. The fuel remaining in the aircraft's tanks as he began his final approach was nearly exhausted. The MiG-25's Tumansky R-15B 300 engines were among the most fuel-hungry power plants in operational service anywhere in the world, and the low-altitude, high-speed portions of the flight had burned through reserves at a rate that left almost nothing for a second approach or a diversion to an alternative field. He had, in practical terms, one chance to land the aircraft. He brought MiG-25P tail number 31 to a stop on the Hakodate runway at approximately 1:50 p.m. local Japan time, the braking bringing the aircraft to rest with approximately 800 feet of pavement remaining, a margin so thin that airport workers watching from the terminal had not been certain the aircraft was going to stop at all. In Moscow, in the Soviet embassy in Tokyo, and in Washington, the telephones were already ringing. The Soviet government's reaction was immediate and furious, in a way that itself revealed how seriously the breach was understood to be. Soviet Ambassador Dmitry Polyansky presented a formal demand to the Japanese government within hours of the landing. The aircraft and the pilot were to be returned immediately. Both were Soviet state property. The defection was characterized officially as a criminal act, and any assistance provided to Belenko by Japanese or American authorities was framed as a violation of the established norms governing relations between states. The diplomatic communication was, by the accounts of Japanese foreign ministry officials who received it, unusually blunt in its register, a sign that the Soviet government understood, even before the full implications of the defection became clear, that something significant had been lost. Japan's position was legally and politically delicate in ways that had no clean resolution. Under established international law, an individual who voluntarily sought asylum could not be forcibly returned against his will to a country from which he was fleeing. Belenko had made his wishes unambiguous from the moment he descended from the cockpit. The Japanese government would not, and under international legal principles could not, hand him back to Soviet authorities regardless of how the Soviet demand was framed. The aircraft was a more complicated question. Its presence on Japanese soil was unauthorized. It had entered Japanese airspace without clearance and had landed at a civilian airport without prior arrangement. But the Soviet Union's formal ownership of the machine was not in legal dispute. Japan had not acquired the aircraft. Japan had not asked for it. It had arrived, uninvited, and now the Japanese government had to determine what to do with a piece of Soviet military property that the Americans were very eager to examine and that the Soviets were very eager to retrieve. American intelligence officers from the CIA's Tokyo station arrived at Hakodate within hours of the landing. The initial contacts with Belenko, conducted partly through interpreters, partly in the limited English he had prepared over months of clandestine study, were focused immediately on two priorities: determining whether the defection was genuine, rather than an elaborate Soviet provocation designed to place a doctored aircraft in American hands, and establishing what Belenko was prepared to provide in terms of information about the aircraft systems and about Soviet air defense capabilities more broadly. Based on those initial conversations, American intelligence officials concluded rapidly that the defection was genuine. Belenko's knowledge of the MiG-25P systems, of his regiment's operational procedures, and of the organizational structure of the PVO Strani was specific and internally consistent in ways that were incompatible with an improvised deception. He described systems, procedures, and limitations that were consistent with what American intelligence had independently gathered from other sources, and that in several cases provided detail and context that the existing intelligence picture had lacked. The Japanese government, after deliberation conducted under intense Soviet pressure and significant quiet American pressure, agreed to allow a team of American technical experts to conduct a comprehensive examination of the aircraft. The terms were negotiated carefully. The examination would be temporary, Japanese personnel would be present throughout the process, and the aircraft would ultimately be returned to the Soviet Union. But the window for examination was real, and American intelligence moved immediately to assemble the team that would exploit it. The unit assembled to examine the MiG-25P came primarily from the United States Air Force's Foreign Technology Division, a specialized analytical unit based at Wright-Patterson Air Force Base in Ohio, responsible for the technical assessment of foreign military technology. The FTD had experience examining Soviet components acquired through various means over the years, wreckage recovered from combat zones in the Middle East, individual parts obtained through third-party channels, technical specifications gathered through clandestine means. They had expertise in reverse engineering partial information into assessments of complete systems. They had never had access to a complete, largely intact Soviet frontline interceptor, with a cooperative and knowledgeable pilot available to explain its systems in detail and correct misconceptions in real time. They arrived at Hakodate within days of the landing, a team of engineers, analysts, and technical specialists who brought with them cameras, precision measurement instruments, material sampling equipment, and a comprehensive methodology for systematic technical documentation and analysis. They worked with discipline and urgency, fully aware that Soviet diplomatic pressure for the aircraft's return was intensifying with each passing day, and that every hour at Hakodate was an hour during which information of significant intelligence value might be gathered or missed. The examination lasted 67 days. What the FTD teams found during that period was, in fundamental respects, not what they had expected. The distance between expectation and reality was not marginal. It was systematic, running through every major system of the aircraft, and it was itself among the most significant findings of the entire operation, because it told American intelligence not just about this aircraft, but about the quality and reliability of the assessments that had been driving American military procurement for nearly a decade. The MiG-25P's electronic systems were, by the standards of Western military technology in 1976, surprisingly primitive in their underlying architecture. Where American military aircraft of the era used transistors and integrated circuits as their electronic building blocks, the MiG-25's avionics relied on vacuum tubes, more than 600 of them by the count of the examining engineers, working through the aircraft's cockpit and electronic bays. Vacuum tubes were an older technology, and the Soviet choice was not irrational. Vacuum tubes can tolerate the electromagnetic pulse generated by a nuclear detonation better than solid-state transistors, a consideration of genuine strategic relevance to an aircraft designed for operations in an environment where nuclear weapons might be employed. The design philosophy was defensible on its own terms, but to the Western engineers examining the aircraft, the presence of hundreds of vacuum tubes was genuinely surprising. The expectation, shaped by years of threat assessments that had credited Soviet engineers with technological sophistication equivalent to or exceeding Western capabilities, had been something closer to the solid-state electronics that filled contemporary American military aircraft. What they found instead was a system architecture that belonged, in certain respects, to an earlier generation of aviation electronics, powerful within its design parameters, but representing a different, and in some ways less advanced technological trajectory than Western intelligence had assumed. The aircraft's fire control radar, the RP-25 Smerch-A, designated Foxfire in NATO's reporting system, was large and powerful, capable of detecting targets at considerable range and providing the fire control data needed to guide the aircraft's long-range missiles to their targets. But the FTD analysis determined that it was vulnerable to countermeasures that Western combat aircraft already carried as standard equipment. In particular, the radar's tracking capability could be significantly degraded or defeated by the deployment of aluminum chaff, the thin metallic strips that aircraft had been carrying as a radar countermeasure since the Second World War. American intelligence assessments had credited Soviet radar with sophisticated chaff rejection capabilities that would diminish the effectiveness of this countermeasure. The actual examination suggested those capabilities were more limited than had been assumed, meaning that existing Western countermeasure equipment would be considerably more effective against the MiG-25's radar than threat assessments had implied. The airframe was constructed primarily from a high-strength nickel-steel alloy rather than from titanium, which Western analysts had assessed as the aircraft's primary structural material. Steel was heavier than titanium, significantly heavier, but it was cheaper, more easily fabricated at the production quantities required for a military fleet, and did not demand the specialized manufacturing expertise that large-scale titanium construction required. Soviet manufacturing capabilities for titanium in the quantities required for fighter production were more limited than American capabilities, and the choice of steel reflected a practical engineering decision that prioritized producibility over the weight savings that titanium would have provided. The steel airframe meant the aircraft was heavier than a titanium frame design would have been, with corresponding implications for fuel consumption, climb performance, and combat maneuvering. The engines, two Tumansky R-15B 300 turbojets, were confirmed to be extraordinarily powerful, producing thrust levels that allowed the aircraft to reach high Mach numbers at altitude. But here, too, the examination revealed the significant gap between the aircraft's reputation and its operational reality. Western intelligence had assessed the MiG-25 as capable of sustained flight at speeds approaching Mach 3.2. In fact, The aircraft's operational ceiling was Mach 2.83. The engines could theoretically be pushed past that limit. They could, under specific conditions, touch Mach 3.2, but only briefly, and at catastrophic cost to the power plant. Maintaining that speed for more than a few minutes would cause irreversible damage to the turbine blades, rendering the engines unusable and requiring complete replacement. Soviet pilots had been explicitly instructed to limit operations at maximum afterburner to specific short-time windows that kept the engines within sustainable parameters. The aircraft was fast, faster in fact than anything in the Western military inventory except the SR-71 Blackbird, which was a reconnaissance aircraft rather than a combat plane. But it was not fast in the sustained, operationally meaningful sense that Western threat assessments had implied. The overall performance assessment that emerged from that systematic examination was sobering for those who had shaped American military procurement decisions based on earlier threat assessments. The MiG-25P was not highly maneuverable. It could not sustain the extreme speeds that Western intelligence had attributed to it. It was not the sophisticated multi-role fighter that the more alarming threat assessments had characterized. It was, the analysis concluded, a high-speed interceptor optimized for a specific and relatively narrow mission, climbing rapidly to altitude and launching long-range missiles at large, relatively slow targets such as strategic bombers, against highly maneuverable fighters operating at lower altitudes and moderate speeds. The MiG-25P would be at a significant disadvantage. The aircraft was dangerous and capable within its design envelope, but that envelope was considerably narrower than a decade of Western assessment had suggested. The implications for American military planning were profound, and they came attached to a considerable irony. The F-15 Eagle, developed explicitly in part as a direct counter to the Foxbat threat as Western intelligence had understood it, turned out to be considerably more capable relative to the actual Soviet aircraft than the original threat assessment had indicated. The billions spent developing the F-15, the design choices made in response to the perceived MiG-25 threat, the procurement priorities established across multiple defense programs, all had been shaped partly around a Soviet aircraft that was considerably less formidable than imagined. The United States had, in a strategic irony that defense analysts would note for years afterward, built an exceptional air superiority fighter, partly in response to a threat that never quite existed in the form it had been conceived. The MiG-25 had inadvertently contributed to the development of a Western aircraft that would prove, in subsequent years, to be among the finest fighters in the world, a legacy considerably more useful to the West than to the Soviet Union, whose aircraft had inspired it. Belenko's contribution to the examination extended well beyond his initial debriefings. He participated actively in explaining the aircraft systems to American and Japanese analysts, answering detailed questions about operational procedures, known deficiencies, maintenance challenges, the specific ways the aircraft behaved differently from how its official specifications suggested it should, and the practical limitations that Soviet pilots navigated in actual operational use. He understood the plane in the way that a working pilot understands his machine, not in terms of the engineering specifications of its components, but in terms of what it would and would not do, what its limitations felt like from the cockpit, and what the operational instructions revealed about the engineering realities underneath. In November 1976, the MiG-25P was returned to the Soviet Union. It did not travel back in the form in which it had arrived. The aircraft was disassembled, carefully, methodically, with all photographs and measurements and material samples already taken and secured, and its components were packed into shipping crates. The Soviet government received, through a series of cargo shipments coordinated via diplomatic channels, what had once been the crown jewel of its aerospace secrecy: the airframe sections, the engine assemblies, the radar systems, the electronic bays, the cockpit instruments and control systems, all of it returned in pieces, crated for transport like disassembled furniture being shipped between apartments. The Soviet government subsequently sent the Japanese government a bill. The invoice, submitted through diplomatic channels with the kind of bureaucratic thoroughness that seemed oblivious to its own absurdity, enumerated alleged damages sustained by the aircraft during the American examination, costs associated with its disassembly and crating, and various other expenses connected with the incident. The amount demanded came to approximately $10 million. The Japanese government, occupying an uncomfortable diplomatic position between a Soviet Union that was furious and an American ally that was satisfied, received the invoice without enthusiasm. The matter was eventually set aside through the kind of diplomatic non-resolution that characterizes many such episodes, formally unresolved, informally forgotten. In Moscow and within the Soviet military establishment, the consequences were concrete and immediate. The commanding officer of the 513th Fighter Aviation Regiment was removed from his position. Other officers at Chuguyevka faced disciplinary proceedings. Security procedures at Soviet air bases were comprehensively reviewed and, in most cases, fundamentally restructured. The proximity of security personnel to aircraft during pre-flight preparations was increased. The protocols for verifying that a departing aircraft was adhering to its filed flight plan were strengthened, and procedures for the management of pilots with access to classified equipment were revised throughout the PVO system. The identification friend or foe transponder codes that Belenko had revealed were immediately changed across the entire MiG-25 fleet, rendering obsolete one category of intelligence he had provided. The possibility that a pilot might, during a routine solo training mission, simply fly his aircraft to a foreign country had not been a contingency that Soviet military planners had systematically addressed before September 6, 1976. After Belenko, it was addressed exhaustively. The modifications made to surviving MiG-25 aircraft were also significant. Knowing that the electronic systems had been comprehensively examined by American engineers, Soviet designers moved to update the radar architecture, revise elements of the avionics, and address other specific vulnerabilities that the Hakodate examination had exposed. The intelligence gathered from the aircraft would gradually diminish in operational relevance as modified variants entered service, though the broader lessons about Soviet design philosophy, manufacturing priorities, and engineering decision-making retained their value considerably longer than the specific technical details of a single aircraft variant. In the Soviet Union, the consequences of Viktor Belenko's decision fell most heavily not on those who had made policy or issued orders, but on people who had had no part in any decision at all. Lyudmila Belenko learned what had happened, the way that the families of Soviet defectors typically learned such things, not through any official notification designed with awareness of its human dimensions, but through the arrival of KGB officers demanding answers to questions about events she genuinely knew nothing about. The interrogations began within hours of the Soviet government's confirmation that Belenko had not suffered an accident or been intercepted, but had landed in Japan and was in the custody of the Japanese authorities, and, effectively, the Americans. Officers questioned Lyudmila repeatedly about her husband's activities in the months before the defection, his contacts within and outside the regiment, his expressed political views, any indication he, however small, however ambiguous, that she might have noticed of his intentions. She had noticed nothing, because there had been nothing to notice. By all available accounts, Belenko had maintained his planning in absolute secrecy, sharing nothing with his wife. He understood, presumably, that her genuine ignorance of his plans was itself a form of protection for her, that a wife who truly did not know could not be broken under interrogation in the way that a wife who knew and had concealed it could. Lyudmila's ignorance was genuine, and genuine ignorance withstands interrogation in ways that maintained deception cannot. The KGB officers who questioned her were experienced enough to recognize the difference. She was not arrested, and no criminal charges were filed against her. Soviet law did not formally allow for the prosecution of family members who had not participated in a crime, but the practical consequences of being the wife of a man who had committed what Soviet law classified as high treason were severe, regardless of formal legal status. The social infrastructure within which she had lived, the community of military families at the base, the professional connections that came with her husband's position, The relationships that had developed within the circumscribed social world of a remote military installation effectively collapsed in the weeks following the defection. The stigma that attached to the families of defectors in Soviet society was real and was enforced through informal mechanisms that required no formal legal action to be devastating. Neighbors distanced themselves. Colleagues became unavailable. The social fabric that made ordinary daily life possible in a closed military community simply withdrew. Dmitry, Viktor, and Ludmila's young son was too young in September 1976 to understand the political or moral dimensions of what his father had done. He was a child who registered that his father was gone and that something was seriously wrong, but who could not yet comprehend what that absence meant, or how permanent it would turn out to be. He would grow up in the shadow of his father's defection, carrying a surname that, in Soviet military and intelligence circles, was permanently associated with one of the most damaging security failures in Soviet history, navigating an educational and professional environment in which his father's choices constituted a stigma that could not be explained away or escaped through any amount of demonstrated personal loyalty or professional achievement. The son of a traitor was marked in Soviet society regardless of his own beliefs or conduct. That was the logic of collective responsibility that the Soviet system applied, and it was not a logic that left much room for individual exoneration. Viktor Belenko's parents and other relatives were also subjected to KGB questioning, their lives disrupted by the investigation into how a Soviet military pilot had managed to fly one of its most closely guarded aircraft to a civilian airport in Japan. The effects on their lives are less extensively documented in the available historical record, but were consistent with the pattern of collective stigmatization that Soviet society systematically imposed on the families of those who had defected to hostile powers, a pattern designed not only to punish the individuals immediately affected, but to deter others from contemplating similar actions by making the potential cost to their families visible and concrete. Viktor Belenko arrived in the United States in the fall of 1976, following his transfer from Japanese custody to American care, and his transit through a series of secure facilities where the most sensitive portions of his debriefing were conducted. The CIA and USAF intelligence officers who conducted those sessions, which stretched over months and covered every aspect of his knowledge of the MiG-25, of Soviet Air Defense Forces organization and doctrine, and of the broader institutional culture of Soviet military aviation, described Belenko in later accounts as cooperative, meticulous, and unusually willing to discuss not only the technical specifics, most immediately valuable to intelligence professionals, but also the broader institutional and human context of Soviet military aviation. He described the gap between official doctrine and operational reality in the PVO. He described the effects of bureaucratic dysfunction on unit effectiveness and maintenance standards. He described the relationship between ideology and actual professional culture in the Soviet military, the ways in which the official version of Soviet military life and the experienced version diverged at virtually every level. His accounts were consistent with other intelligence gathered through different means, and in several cases provided context or detail that significantly enhanced the value of information already in American hands. American intelligence officials who participated in those debriefings characterized Belenko's contribution as extraordinary in scope and in the quality of insight it provided into the organizational realities of a Soviet military service that Western intelligence had studied extensively but imperfectly. He also provided briefings to members of the United States Congress, describing Soviet air defense capabilities in terms that informed American legislative deliberations on military spending and strategic posture during the late 1970s, a period in which debates about the military balance between NATO and the Warsaw Pact were central to American policy discussions. He was given a new identity. The specific details of that identity were carefully protected and remained so. He was resettled somewhere in the United States. He eventually disclosed as the years passed and the operational sensitivity of his location diminished, various details about his American life, but the precise mechanics of his resettlement were matters he discussed selectively and that the American government continued to treat with discretion. He received financial support in the initial period, allowing him to establish himself before he could support himself through his own work. He learned English systematically. He had begun studying the language in the Soviet Union, but the clandestine nature of that study meant his English at the time of his defection was functional rather than fluent. He was an intelligent man with a demonstrated capacity for technical learning, and his fluency improved rapidly. Within a few years, he was giving lectures to American military audiences, to intelligence community gatherings, and at academic institutions interested in his first-hand perspective on Soviet military culture, the organizational realities of Soviet aviation, and the experience of living and working inside a system whose public representations bore little relationship to its operational realities. He worked as an aviation consultant, applying his expertise in high-performance aircraft to work with American defense contractors and government agencies that valued what a former Soviet fighter pilot knew about Soviet aircraft training and tactics. He remarried. He had children. He built, over years, something that resembled a stable and meaningful life, not the life he had planned when he was a cadet learning to fly, not the life he had grown up expecting to live, but a life that offered satisfactions and freedoms that the life he had left behind did not, and he came to believe could not have provided. In 1980, John Barron's account of the defection was published by Reader's Digest Press. MiG pilot, the final escape of Viktor Belenko, drew on interviews with Belenko and on information gathered during his debriefings that the American government had determined could be made available to the public after several years had elapsed. The book reached a wide audience and brought Belenko's story out of the classified files and the restricted briefings and into public awareness for the first time. It presented the defection not just as a Cold War intelligence success, but as what it had always also been. The account of a man who had found the Soviet system impossible to continue to inhabit, and who had made an extreme and irreversible choice to escape it. He spoke periodically in the years that followed, reflecting on the defection, on the Soviet system, on the experience of starting over in a foreign country in a life built from entirely new materials. He reflected on what America had looked like from the distance of a Soviet air base in Primorsky Krai, the prohibited broadcasts, the clandestine publications, the image he had assembled from incomplete and imperfect sources, and on how that image had compared to the reality he eventually encountered. He was not, in those reflections, a simple triumphalist. He acknowledged America's genuine complexities, but he was consistent in his view that the choice he had made, the specific, irreversible, costly choice, had been the right one for him. He was less forthcoming, in most of those conversations, about what the choice had cost the people he had left behind. His son Dmitri, the child he had left in the Soviet Union, who had grown up without him, who had carried the weight of his father's reputation throughout his Soviet childhood and adolescence, remained a subject that Belenko addressed carefully in the rare instances when he addressed it at all. The Soviet Union dissolved in 1991, removing the formal political barrier that had made any direct contact between father and son impossible, though the human barriers that decades of absence and circumstance had constructed were not dissolved by political events. Whether the two men were able to find any meaningful relationship in the years after the Soviet Union's end is not fully established in the available public record. What is clear is that the separation was among the deepest and most enduring costs of the choice Belenko had made, and that no amount of professional success or personal reconstruction in the United States fully compensated for it. Viktor Belenko died on September 24th, 2023. He was 76 years old. His obituary in the New York Times, published in the days following his death, recounted the essential facts of his defection in the measured language appropriate for such records: the date, the aircraft, the airport, the 67 days of examination, the broad intelligence significance. It noted that he had spent nearly half a century living in the United States, that he had worked as an aviation consultant and lecturer, and that he had become, in the relevant communities, a figure whose defection remained, nearly 50 years after the fact, one of the most consequential single acts in the documented history of Cold War intelligence operations. The obituary did not dwell at length on what had been left behind. That was not what obituaries were for, but the things left behind were real, and they had persisted long after the strategic intelligence value of the MiG-25 examination had been absorbed, analyzed, applied, and superseded by the development of new aircraft and new technologies that made the Foxbat's specific capabilities and limitations matters of historical rather than operational significance. The Belenko defection is remembered within intelligence and military aviation communities primarily as an extraordinary intelligence success, the acquisition of an intact Soviet frontline interceptor, the revelation that a decade of threat assessments had been built on significant misunderstandings, the correction of force planning and procurement decisions that had been proceeding in directions shaped by those misunderstandings. All of those things are true, and their importance is genuine. The 67 days of examination at Hakodate produced intelligence that shaped American military thinking in ways that can be traced through the analyses, assessments, and procurement decisions that followed. But the defection was also something else. A human choice with human consequences, made by a man operating within a system he could no longer accept, using the one asset he possessed that was valuable enough to guarantee his passage out of that system. He used the MiG-25 as a currency. He traded it for a life in a country he had studied in secret for years, a country whose reality he could only partially understand from the distance of a Far Eastern Soviet airbase, and that would turn out to be, like all human realities, considerably more complicated than the image he had assembled from prohibited broadcasts and clandestine publications. He was not wrong that Soviet life was, for him and for millions of others, genuinely constrained and maintained on a foundation of systematic dishonesty. He was not wrong that the system he had served was built on coercion and sustained by the suppression of the kind of free inquiry he had come to value. His disillusionment was not naive. It was, by the evidence of the system's subsequent history, its eventual total collapse, a reasonably accurate reading of something that was genuinely and deeply wrong, but he made his choice in a way that required leaving a child behind. He made it without warning or consultation with Ludmila, who then faced the KGB and the social consequences of a defection she had not chosen and could not have anticipated. He made it knowing that the aircraft he landed at Hakodate would be taken apart, and that its examination would expose vulnerabilities that Soviet engineers would then work to correct, meaning that some of the most immediate strategic value would be temporary, even as the human cost to the people he had left behind would persist without any equivalent diminishment. The question of whether he made the right choice does not admit of a simple answer. He bore responsibility for the consequences of his decision, including the consequences to people who had no part in making it. He also bore those consequences himself, not in the form of legal punishment, since he faced no prosecution, but in the form of permanent separation from a son, permanent displacement from a country and a culture, permanent existence under an assumed name in a life that had to be built from nothing. He carried both sides of his choice, what he had gained and what it had cost, for nearly half a century. In the end, the photograph taken at Hakodate on September 6, 1976, the image of a gray Soviet fighter sitting on a civilian runway surrounded by Japanese police and stunned airport workers who had no framework for what they were seeing, became one of the defining images of the Cold War's human dimensions, the moment when the most classified aircraft in the Soviet arsenal turned out also to be a vehicle for one man's escape. Photographs capture surfaces. They do not capture what Viktor Belenko was thinking as he descended from the cockpit and raised his hands. They do not capture what his son Dmitry experienced growing up in his father's shadow. They do not capture the interrogations, the decades of separation, or the complicated and unresolved remainder of the story that continued in multiple lives long after the cameras had moved on to something else. Viktor Belenko was 29 years old when he lifted off from Chuguyevka on what his flight plan said was a training mission. He was 76 when he died, 47 years later, in a country that was not the one in which he had been born or the one for which he had once been willing to die. In the intervening decades, the political system he had defected from had ceased to exist. The country that had received him had changed in ways he could not have anticipated when he was studying its language in secret in his quarters at a remote Far Eastern air base. The aircraft he had delivered had been taken apart bolt by bolt and shipped back in crates, and the intelligence it produced had been integrated into assessments and plans that had themselves been superseded by subsequent events, subsequent technologies, subsequent history. What had not been superseded, because it was not the kind of thing that becomes obsolete, was the human cost. Ludmila built a life without a husband, in a society that viewed her as tainted by association with treason she had not committed and could not explain. Dmitri grew up without a father, carrying a surname permanently associated with one of the most embarrassing security failures in Soviet military history. Viktor lived for nearly 5 decades, with the knowledge of what his choice had cost the people he had left behind, and with whatever private calculus of gain and loss that knowledge required him to maintain until the end. He had, in the language of Cold War strategic accounting, defected. In the language of his own life, he had simply tried to become a person whose existence felt honest and worth living, and had succeeded, imperfectly and at great cost, in ways that could be neither simply celebrated nor simply condemned.